They were against the races coming together, but they were not for terrorism, hate, and murder, which that was. We received so much outpouring support from around the world that if you look in the balcony, we got a window from the people of Wales who donated a window to show their solidarity with the church. It depicts a black man suffering in the South like Christ on the cross, one hand pushing out hate, the other hand open for forgiveness, and the bullets to the chest says, bullets going through the chest, and the inscription on the bottom says, "You do it to me." The rainbow around Christ's head is a sign of the rainbow back in Genesis, where God promised never again to destroy the world this way. And I believe this conference is here today to let us say never again. Never again in our house of worship, never again to another faith community, never again will we tolerate hate. So we welcome you to the 16th Street Baptist Church, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have here today. God bless you.
Thank you, Pastor Price. I should have had him first, see? Please welcome up, speaking on behalf of Jay Town, the U.S. Attorney of the Northern District, Mr. Lloyd Peoples, who's the first Assistant U.S. Attorney, with remarks.
Thank you. My name is Lloyd Peoples, and I'm the first Assistant U.S. Attorney here in Birmingham, the local arm of the Department of Justice. I, too, want to thank the FBI and the Civil Rights Institute for hosting this event. As we've heard, civil rights has such a deep history, not only in this state and in this city, but in this very spot. I believe that this year's focus on hate crimes in places of worship will continue the tradition of this conference to highlight areas that are important to the civil rights community, and it is especially meaningful given the history where we are today. In civil rights, as with other areas of law enforcement cooperation, communication is key. But it's not just communication between federal, state, and local law enforcement. It's communication with our community partners, with community activists, and with the citizens who are here today. We need to be able to celebrate our successes and learn from those areas where maybe we fell a little bit short. Celebrating our successes gives us the energy and the encouragement to continue moving on, knowing that we are making a difference. And learning from those areas that we fell short makes it so that we can get it better and get it right the next time. Because unfortunately, we know there will be somebody who tries a next time. Hopefully, when that occurs, conferences such as this and the education that we have means that law enforcement will be there, will be ready, and will be better able to do what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. And just checking if we have someone from the mayor's office, Mayor Randall Woodfin's office, to speak on behalf of the city of Birmingham. If they do arrive, we will allow someone to come up. But for now, please welcome Grady Fisher, who's the Supervisory Special Agent of the Civil Rights Unit of the FBI Headquarters. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. I'm honored, and can we just take a minute to appreciate how beautiful this church is? And can I please get another round of applause for these beautiful voices up here? Thank you. Thank you. Civil rights is a priority for the FBI. Hate crimes in particular, as of recent times, has become big news. And I can tell you from a headquarters perspective, I'm a supervisory special agent at the Civil Rights Unit, which means I'm a program manager for the South Central region. I cover both of the big field offices in Alabama, and I come from the Jackson Division. I can tell you that civil rights is so important. I've been in law enforcement for over 15 years, and the most impactful cases that I've worked have been civil rights cases. In fact, I'm happy to report to you that recently I worked a cross burning in the state of Mississippi in front of a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and that subject was sentenced about 2 weeks ago to 11 years in prison. That was one of the most impactful cases I've ever been a part of. To see and hear from those victims that they were able to get justice in a case like that makes all the difference in the world. That's meaningful. Okay, I can tell you this, that as a program manager at headquarters, your Birmingham division has some very dedicated and committed people that are passionate about working these crimes. I love working with them. I love hearing from them. I love providing those resources from a headquarters level. I'm going to be here throughout this. I know you guys have a great lineup, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But again, I'm honored to be here. If anybody has any questions for me, I'll be around. Please come shake my hand. I'd love to get to know you. So have a great conference here. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisory Special Agent. We are going to get to the dynamic program that he talked about, and I think it's so cool that you guys are spending these next 2 days to really focus on this. I am reminded as a journalist that our children watch. While the world watches, our children watch. And in this place, our children paid the price. And so it is my hope that we all leave here after these next 2 days with knowledge that we're able, especially those of us from the community, knowledge that we're able to impart to the people that we know and touch every day, our families, and so they know the importance of the work that you all do. I get the honor of introducing our keynote speaker today. Her name is Sharon L. Davies. Sharon is the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Spelman College, and inside your program there's a lot of information on her. I'm going to just read some of the highlights that caught my eye. For 22 years at The Ohio State University, she served on the faculty as the Gregory Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, but also in her background, she served for 5 years as the Assistant United States Attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. Teaches civil rights, criminal law, criminal procedure, race, law, and evidence. She is also an accomplished author, and a dynamic work that she wrote in 2010 where the Oxford University Press published a narrative nonfiction account of a 1921 murder in Birmingham, Alabama. It's titled Rising Road, and that is the title of what she will present to us this evening, A True Tale of Love, Race, and Religion in America. You should know that the Birmingham mayor back in 2010 presented her with a key to our city. So please welcome Sharon Davies.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to rely on my friends in the back who have their hands on technology to help assist me with the presentation that I put together for this event. It is a privilege to be able to speak in this special place. The 16th Street Baptist Church has become a church not just beloved by the Birmingham community, but by the entire nation since what happened here in 1963 in September. When I was told that the presentation that I would have a chance to give about my book, Rising Road, was to happen in this special place, I wanted to connect the dots a little bit between the story that captured my attention, which occurred here in Birmingham in 1921, and then the events much later in 1963, because both of those events involved hate directed at different communities, to be sure, but incidents of hate that the community didn't adequately respond to. And so because of our failures to understand the dimensions of the dangers that went along with allowing hate like that to be a part of one's community, it was almost destined that we would suffer other horrors down the road. It's an important reminder to us, I think, even today, to be able to hear what I am phrasing for today's purposes as the rhyme of history. We all have heard the statement, history repeats itself, but Mark Twain actually disputed that. He once wrote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I'm going to suggest that it's the rhymes in history. If we pay attention, if we try to hear those rhymes, the things that sound in the familiar, the things that strike a chord and remind us of something that happened in the past that we are uneasy about or ashamed of, even having had occurred in our community. If we can hear rhymes like that, then we might know that this is another dangerous moment, that if we don't get it right, we could suffer some very big consequences. So I really want to connect the dots as much as possible between the events that happened right inside and beside St. Paul Catholic Church in 1921 on August 11th, and what happened here in September of 1963 when a bomb went off in this building. The subject of my book, Rising Road, started on August 11th, 1921, when these two young people decided that they wanted to get married. One was Ruth Stevenson. She was 18 years old. The other was a man named Pedro Guzman, and he was in his early 30s. That may seem like a big gap in age now to us, but at that time it actually wasn't that much of a unusual thing for people who were very different ages to get married to each other. These two had met and had a secret relationship with each other. It's hard to know exactly how much time that they got to spend with each other, but Pedro Guzman was a young man who worked for Sherwin-Williams at the time as a wallpaper hanger, and Ruth Stevenson's family had invited him into their home to hang wallpaper in their home, and he met Ruth by doing that work, and the two of them struck up a relationship and decided that they wanted to get married. They had to wait to do that until Ruth was 18 years old, because the two of them had reason to believe that Ruth's parents would not like the idea. Pedro Guzman was a Catholic. He was a Puerto Rican. He had come into the United States as a very young man. He was well liked in Birmingham, but her parents would not have liked him. And when I first heard about the story and it captured my attention, I was sure that the reason that they wouldn't like him had to do with race or ethnicity. I was really surprised to find out that it was a lot more complicated than that, and it was more connected to their hatred, the hatred of Ruth's parents, the Reverend Edwin Stevenson and Mary Stevenson. It had more to do with religious bigotry, the fact that Pedro Guzman was a Catholic and Edwin Stevenson, who was an ordained Methodist minister, hated Catholics. Now, that wasn't an unusual thing at that time. It was actually extraordinarily popular to be anti-Catholic in the early 1900s. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan had made Catholics, alongside its favorite targets, black people, had made Catholics and Jews and immigrants that were coming into the country at that time from particular countries, had made them their targets as well. And so Edwin Stevenson was one of the many men of Birmingham who found appeal in the Ku Klux Klan and decided to join it. Now, this was not the first Klan of the days following emancipation of the slaves. This was the second Klan, and historians tell us that the second Klan was the most successful Klan in American history. It was the one that had so much popularity that ministers like Edwin Stevenson and many other men of prominence in communities were drawn to it. The reason that so many were drawn to it, and the estimates range for as many as 8 million men at that time in the country decided to don the robes of the Ku Klux Klan. The reason its message of hate was so popular was that it didn't call it a message of hate at all. It rebranded itself as a patriotic organization. It was extremely successful in convincing men to join it because they would be the patriots that the country needed. They would be the protectors of their communities against the threats that the organizers of the Ku Klux Klan were selling at that time. And among those threats were folks like Catholics and Jews and immigrants from new countries like South and Eastern Europe, not the older countries that had sent so many immigrants into the United States by that point, but from countries where they would come with different dialects, not speaking English, but speaking other languages, with darker complexions, with different religions. And all of those things struck the men of the Ku Klux Klan as threats to the country that they knew. And when people feel a threat to the country that makes them feel most comfortable, and they feel that those things are going away because of new arrivals, then that's when we are at most danger of doing things like joining fraternal organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. This message definitely struck a chord here in Birmingham. There was a very large and active chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Reverend Edwin Stevenson was one of them, but he had good company. It was filled with doctors and lawyers, ministers, and police officers. The police were actively involved in the Ku Klux Klan at this time. It's one of the saddest things that law enforcement has to remember to realize when we put together conferences like this. The Klan told every new member to find 10 others to join their chapter, and this is just one picture that shows in the background the Klansmen sitting with all of the new recruits who are taking that secret oath. The Klan also believed that it was able to say who was truly an American, who was not. And in other words, they had a litmus test for true Americans, and if you didn't pass it, you might as well go back to where you came from. So a rhyme of history, if that sounds familiar to you, that's when we know that we have to pay attention, or we may miss the lessons that we thought we learned from days past. So at this time, it wouldn't be at all unusual to see in magazines and other publications cartoons that made fun of priests and enormously popular magazines that outsold the major newspapers of the day that were anti-Catholic publications. And these publications not just questioned Catholics' allegiance to the country, but claimed that they couldn't have allegiance to the country because they owed their allegiance to a foreign leader, the Pope in Rome. They also were filled with attacks on what it was that Catholics were intending to do in this country. There were claims very frequently made that Catholic men, those Knights of Columbus, were stashing away weapons in the basements of their church buildings, their convents, their monasteries, and they were waiting for the day that the Pope would send a signal to those Knights of Columbus for the insurrection to begin, when they would take over the country. Now, when I talk to my students about that, they sometimes chuckle a little bit about how could you be so afraid of Catholics? Catholics really that scary? But at the time, they were very frightening enough for many states, including the state of Alabama, to pass laws that criminalized certain things, that made the warrantless inspection of Catholic buildings possible, and made it a crime for anyone to warn someone within a Catholic building that the inspectors were on their way. They would send these inspectors into these buildings to look for those weapon stashes that they believed were there, or young women who were being wrongfully seduced away from their rightful religions, who were being beguiled by priests into these buildings where they might be held captive. All of that may seem hysterical to us today, but they were very real fears, and you know that they're real when there are laws that are actually passed that bear witness to them, like the convent inspection laws. So this was the backdrop for the leading Catholic preacher or reverend at that time, Father James E. Coyle. James Coyle was born and raised in Ireland. He was ordained in Rome, and then he was sent as a brand new priest to Alabama, of all places. And that was because there were streams of Catholics who were coming into communities in Alabama, including to Birmingham. This is a picture of James Coyle and his sister Marcella, and a picture of St. Paul Catholic Church. Someone you will recognize. It sits over on 3rd Avenue. It's a beautiful cathedral now. At that time, it was still a church, and right next to the church was St. Paul Catholic Rectory. It has now been replaced by a brick building, but this is what it looked like at the time, and it's where James Coyle lived. You can imagine that Father Coyle was quite busy, given all of the anti-Catholicisms, defending his faith, and that is true. He was so busy that he became sort of a persona non grata to all of those folks who were attracted to the Ku Klux Klan at the time. He became the most hated Catholic in the state of Alabama because of his willingness to openly and publicly defend his faith. And so at this time, he became so unpopular by anti-Catholics that the FBI of the day began to hear about death threats. This is an age when Catholic churches were being burnt to the ground, so we heard about arson as being one of those crimes. It wasn't an unusual thing for Catholic churches to be burnt, and the FBI began to intercept death threats on James Coyle's life. His congregants began to ask him to be a little quieter in his defense of his faith and his defense of them, because they were afraid. And they really had a lot to be afraid of, because violence was real at this time. But James Coyle had a special kind of courage, and he would end every day sitting at this swing on this church where anybody who wanted to see him would be able to find him there. On the day that Ruth Stevenson and Pedro Guzman got married, they found their way to St. Paul's Church. Not intentionally. They were actually trying to avoid St. Paul's Church because they knew that Ruth Stevenson's father, who was known as the marrying parson of Birmingham, would hang out in the county courthouse right next door on the same block. And he would wait in the halls for young people to show up to get their marriage licenses, and then he would offer to marry them right there in the halls. And so he became known as the marrying parson. But with him doing all of that activity right next door, Ruth and Pedro didn't want to go to St. Paul's Church, so they decided to go somewhere else. And I'll read you a little bit from my book about that day and what happened that brought them back to St. Paul's. Ruth and Pedro had agreed to make August 11th, 1921 look like a normal work day. They had agreed to meet at noon with a plan to take the streetcar to Bessemer, where they would apply for their license to avoid running into Ruth's father at the courthouse in Birmingham. But when the time for Ruth to meet Pedro that day arrived, and she moved toward the front door of the store where she was working, one of her uncles was just walking in. She was sure she would be caught, she said later, but by some act of heaven, the man failed to see her, and Ruth willed her feet to keep moving until she reached the spot outside where Pedro was waiting. In Bessemer, they were nearly foiled again. After they had obtained their license from the probate judge, they walked a few blocks to the local Catholic church, St. Aloysius, and asked to speak with Father Callahan, its presiding priest. But the priest was out. He would not be back in time to perform their rites, they were told. How strange, the things that can unravel a plan. The possibility that Father Callahan might be away had obviously not occurred to them. After formulating a secret meeting place, dodging Ruth's relative, sidestepping the place her father was most likely to be, and obtaining the state's official permission to wed, the last critical ingredient needed to accomplish their plan, a priest, was missing. It could not have been easy for the couple to decide to return to Birmingham. The Bessemer marriage license authorized any official pastor in the state to marry them, so if they could make it to St. Paul's unseen, they could ask Father Coyle for his help. But the rectory was terrifyingly close to the courthouse where Ruth's father conducted marriages in the hallways. If Stevenson happened to step outside as they were approaching the rectory, all would be lost. Worse, had Ruth and Pedro known the full truth that Edwin Stevenson was already on the lookout for his daughter, that he had been canvassing the streets all afternoon, that he and Mary Stevenson had alerted the police there, and a private detective as well, all of whom were making efforts to find the girl, the prospect of returning to the city would likely have been unthinkable. But the couple labored under that great advantage of ignorance, and being unaware of the determined multiplicity of efforts already underway in the city to discover her, Ruth and Pedro resolved to double back to Birmingham to be married at St. Paul's. And somehow they managed it. When the streetcar arrived back in the city, Pedro and Ruth stepped off it and moved toward the towering twin steeples that guarded the entrance of St. Paul's. The bustle of the downtown streets must have conferred some soothing, frenetic cover, helping them pass undetected, even across 3rd Avenue and straight up the walkway to the rectory door. But there, luck failed them again. Father Coyle was out, Father Brady told them. He was visiting with Father Malone at the rebuilt St. Catherine's Church in nearby Pratt City. And because Ruth and Pedro had posted no bands at St. Paul's announcing their plans to marry in advance, by church rule, only its presiding priest, Father Coyle, possessed the authority to take their vows. It might have seemed that heaven itself was testing their firmness. Later, no doubt, with the maddening benefit of hindsight, Father Brady must have wished he had just sent the twosome away. But at that moment, as he looked at the couple standing on the threshold of the rectory, no doubt he read the desperation on their faces. The urge to assist them must have been strong. He could call St. Catherine's to see if Father Coyle could be reached, Father Brady offered. Ruth and Pedro said they would wait. And they did wait, and Father Coyle did make it back to St. Paul's, and he looked at their marriage license, and he saw that they had the state's permission to get married, and he married them in St. Paul. About an hour later, he was sitting on his porch, on his swing, and up the walkway walked Edwin Stevenson with a loaded gun. He shot 3 times and hit Father Coyle in the head, which quickly caused his death. Now, all of that happened in late afternoon, August 11th, 1921, on a busy street in 3rd Avenue in Birmingham, and there were a lot of people around who saw it and who heard it and who would be called to talk about it. But Stevenson never denied that he shot Father Coyle. What he did was he turned himself in right away, and his first claim was that he shot in self-defense. Now, this is a difficult claim. He was seen walking up to the porch with a loaded gun. The priest who he shot and killed was unarmed, and yet Stevenson claimed that the two of them had gotten into words after Stevenson learned that he had married his daughter to Pedro Guzman, and he said that Father Coyle got up and hit him and knocked him to his knees. And he was so in fear for his life that he pulled the gun that he happened to have on him and shot the priest in self-defense. Now, it was a difficult claim because the trajectory of the bullets in the future investigation would show that the bullet entered the priest's head, arcing downward as though he was diving out of the way, trying to protect himself. No one saw a fist fight between 2 grown men or heard it. And so the self-defense claim would have difficulty, but it was the best that Stevenson could do, at least at the time, before he attained legal counsel. Very quickly, the prosecutor, a circuit solicitor named Joseph Tate, Joe Tate, would look at the evidence and decide that this was nothing but first-degree premeditated murder. And he would fight to get charges brought against the minister for that murder, he would have to fight. He found out very quickly when he went into the grand jury, and the grand jury was uncharacteristically slow in their deliberations about whether to return an indictment for first-degree murder. There's an old saying that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich if a prosecutor asks for it, but that did not appear to be the case when the prosecutor, Joe Tate, asked the grand jury to indict Ruth Stevenson's father. And it turned out that he would need the assistance of Ruth Stevenson herself in convincing the grand jury to bring those charges. Ruth Stevenson decided that she would testify against her father, and that she had a lot to say to the grand jury about how much Edwin Stevenson hated Catholics and hated Father Coyle in particular. He and Mary Stevenson had said on other occasions that they wished he was dead, and that the entire church would burn to the ground. But even with the assistance of Ruth Stevenson and the physical evidence and other witnesses that Joe Tate would find and convince to help him bring these charges, it was going to be an uphill battle. One of the things that made it an uphill battle was that the Ku Klux Klan raised money to hire an attorney for Edwin Stevenson, and that was a young, up-and-coming attorney in Birmingham, Alabama, known as Hugo Black. Now, some of you may recognize the name Hugo Black. It's on one of the courthouses here in Birmingham right now. This would be Hugo Black, who would go on to enormous professional success in his life as an attorney. He would be elected as a United States Senator for the state of Alabama, and he would eventually be appointed to the United States Supreme Court, where he would serve for decades. But this was Hugo Black before he was Hugo Black. He was an up-and-coming lawyer. He was also a member of the Klan. And the Klan paid for this Klansman to lead the defense. The trial took place in Jefferson County Courthouse, and that was also on 3rd Avenue. It was a beautiful old building. It doesn't exist anymore. It was one of those old buildings that we didn't recognize the value of enough to repurpose it. But at the time, it became the site in October of 1921 of a criminal trial that was of interest across the nation. One of the most surprising things to me when I was researching this case was how a crime in a criminal trial that had captured the attention of the nation could be forgotten almost completely. Even folks from Birmingham don't always remember this story, and certainly people from outside Birmingham in the state of Alabama are very likely to never have heard of it. I certainly had not heard of it, despite the fact that a future Supreme Court justice would be involved in the defense of this Methodist minister for this infamous crime of shooting an unarmed Catholic church in cold blood. But Hugo Black was a very talented legal thinker, and he understood that the self-defense claim might, even in front of a friendly jury, have some difficulty. So on the eve of trial, he added a new defense to the charge, and that was, let's see if I can get this, new defense, and that was temporary insanity. It's a beautiful thing when it works. If you have temporary insanity, it doesn't mean you're insane enough to have to go and spend time in the asylum down in Tuscaloosa at the time, and you might walk out of the courthouse a free man if you could convince a jury that there was something that so disrupted your ability to hold on to your mental faculties that you no longer had any control over your conduct, at least temporarily. And that was what Hugo Black decided was going to be necessary for him to defend this minister. It was a packed courthouse. This is the one remaining, you might be able to see it a little bit, remaining picture of the trial. And it was taken when Edwin Stevenson himself was on the stand. An unusual thing, because not all criminal defense attorneys put their clients on the stand, but in this case, Hugo Black thought it would be important for the jury to hear from the defendant himself about how much his household had been under assault by the Catholics, and in particular, this one Catholic man, Father James Coyle, who had seduced his daughter to convert from her rightful religion of Methodism just a couple of months before she decided to run off and marry Pedro Guzman. And Ruth Stevenson had secretly converted to Catholicism without her parents' wishes. Edwin Stevenson wanted the jury to believe that that was Father James Coyle's fault. And he also to make sure that the jury was convinced that Edwin Stevenson was protecting his household and had been pushed too far by the news that his daughter had been married to a Catholic. He wanted the jury to believe that any father at that time, or certainly any white Protestant father at that time, would have done what Stevenson did if they had been faced with this kind of news too. To put the final nail in that coffin, the defense attorney called in Pedro Guzman as Edwin Stevenson was in the middle of his testimony. Now, this is an enormously unusual thing to do, to use a human being as a physical exhibit, but that's what Hugo Black did. He had Pedro Guzman walked in from the back of the courtroom and stood up in front of the jury and just asked the jurors to look at the man. Reporters said later that Hugo Black had pulled the blinds to the courtroom so that the darker complexion of Pedro Guzman was emphasized as he stood uncomfortably in front of the juror until he was excused. And then he never put Pedro Guzman himself on the stand. He wanted to suggest that Guzman might actually not be Puerto Rican, he might be black, or at least part black. And if that were the case, surely any father in Edwin Stevenson's shoes would have lost control over his mental faculties when faced with the news that his daughter had been married to that man. So that was what happened at the trial in 1921. And I wish I could tell you that the story had a happy ending. But no matter Joe Tate's efforts, he could not, in 1921, convince the jury that had Klansmen on it, in a courtroom presided over a judge who was himself a Klansman, that it should convict a fellow Klansman, even one who had been seen shooting in cold blood an unarmed Catholic priest on the porch of his own home. So that's where Birmingham was in 1921. And how different would Birmingham be in 1960s when 4 young girls' lives were ended abruptly in this church at the hands of Klansmen who thought that that community needed to be told about what their place was too, and were getting too out of control with the marches and the demonstrations that the black community had been involved with earlier that year. The statement of Mark Twain that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, is a challenge to each and every one of us. It's a challenge for moral people to hear the rhymes of history, the way in which 1963 and the things that were happening in this community in 1963 rhymed with the things that were happening in 1921 when Father James Coyle's life was taken, and it was impossible to bring his killer to justice. It is a challenge for moral people to hear the rhyme so that we don't repeat the mistakes of our past. What kinds of things would we do if we heard the rhymes between now and what has happened in our past? Well, it rhymes when we fail to heed the true heroes who are among us, who at great personal risk to themselves urge us toward the better angels of our nature. Joe Tate was one of those true heroes that the community failed to heed, and then decades later, Martin Luther King, who was leading marches in the streets of Birmingham and was called an outside agitator, was one of those heroes who we again did not heed the message of until after he himself was assassinated. So when we fail to heed the messages of our true heroes, we are actually engaged in the rhymes of history. We also will know, or maybe hear, the rhyme of history when wrongdoers and wrongful thinkers like Reverend Edwin Stevenson, even murderers like Stevenson, are held up as community champions instead of who they truly are. History rhymes when we remain silent in the face of hate and we let crimes go, and particularly crimes against the marginalized of our community, go unpunished. It wasn't possible in 1965 to bring 4 Klansmen to justice for the bombing that occurred in this church. It would only be possible, in 1963, it would only be possible in the 1970s to bring the first charge or indictment against one of those men. It would be, I think, not until the 1990s when the other 2 remaining suspects were finally brought to justice. We know that history is rhyming when we have such difficulty finding justice for the loss of innocent lives. We also know that it rhymes when we hear language like the language that was used by Louisiana governor in the 1950s, who was asked about, what do you think about the white persons councils in the state of Louisiana, governor? And he said, well, I think that there are extremists on both sides, comparing the NAACP to the white citizens councils. When we hear things like that those who fight for civil rights are compared or equated with those who oppose civil rights, we know that history rhymes, and I don't think I need to tell you about a recent rhyme that sounds a little bit like that. So when we hear those parallels, the things that strike a chord, that sound in the familiar, then we know we're at a moment when it's necessary for us to do things differently if we don't want to repeat the lessons of our past. Things rhyme when bigotry and violence are justified as not bigotry. They are justified as actions that are supposedly safeguarding our community, or actions that are preserving our national security, or actions that are returning us to some glorified past. Now, you can't really read this particular Citizens Council advertisement. It actually happened in June of 1963, just a couple of months before this church was bombed. Basically, what it was a call to white citizens of Selma, Alabama, not to allow their community to become what Birmingham was becoming, with all of its marches and sit-ins and outside agitation, that they had to stand up, and if they didn't want to become another Birmingham, and it asked them the question, ask yourself the question, what have I personally done to maintain segregation? Now, when that can be said openly and unapologetically, you know that the speakers are not those who believe themselves to be engaged in bigotry. They believe themselves to be engaged in righteous action. In action that is preserving something of value that is being lost or threatened. They are protectors of their communities. And when you hear things like that, and you think about things that are happening in our time that sound in the familiar, you may be thinking of racism against people of color and the unjust treatment of immigrant groups. And so if you can think about incidents that we read about and hear about on our nightly news today and hear the rhyme, then it is a call to each and every one of us not to stay silent, to be a part of those who fight for the country that we want. Because when we fail to do that, then those rhymes will end up resulting in new incidents of violence and shame that we will be talking about decades later in spaces like this, shaking our heads at as though there wasn't something that was quite continuous from each and every one of these horrors to what is just the newest one of those. So may I end my comments today with an Irish blessing that I have at the front of Rising Road. I include it out of homage to the Father Coyle, whose life was taken. And I write this about the title of the book. The inspiration for the title, Rising Road, was the aged Irish blessing set out at the front of the book. It seemed an appropriate homage to the life of Father James Coyle, native son of Ireland. More broadly, though, the title is offered as a reminder of our very human, if at moments largely aspirational, journey away from fears that can divide us. Perhaps it is always in hindsight that we are best able to see the failings of our prejudices. If so, May the road continue to rise before us, bringing us closer to the day when it is our commonalities rather than our differences that we see most clearly. Thank you very much.
What a powerful presentation. Thank you, Sharon Davies. There are members of our local law enforcement community in the room today, and I just want to take a moment to recognize a few of them. I saw Sheriff Mark Petway come in a little earlier, so we do acknowledge you. Chief Patrick Smith, if you are here, anyone from your office, or also our DA, Jefferson County District Attorney Danny Carr, if you were here, I see you. I just want to recognize you guys and thank you for being here and being a part of this powerful two-day conference. Next up is a short film. It's called Pursuit of Justice. Edie Hand, a film producer, an author, media personality, and lecturer, and Mark Sims, CPA, is the executive producer of Pursuit of Justice. Please tell me which of the buttons to push. It's on.
Never been more interest in a case in our state's history. And now the eyes of the world are on this jury. People everywhere are waiting to see if 12 Southern men will serve justice. What is your duty necessary to do it? People everywhere are waiting to see if we will permit bigotry and religious prejudice to set a cold-blooded murderer free. You are called to do it. We are all called to do what is right, no matter the cost.
This is the 1920s. The nation is in the throes of great change. Prohibition is in force. Women are pushing new boundaries. Communism was on the rise in parts of the world, causing a Red Scare. And you've got the Ku Klux Klan. These are your neighbors. Some are your friends. Many were pillars of Birmingham society.
The Klan was an organization that attacked and terrorized the black community in the South, but it was much more than that. And the Klan was a terrorist organization toward Catholics too, toward immigrants.
So when Father James Coyle agreed to do the marriage ceremony for Ruth Stevenson to Pedro Guzman, Edwin Stevenson shot Father Coyle in broad daylight.
But it wasn't the open and shut case you might think it should have been.
Hugo Black, the lead defense lawyer, the brilliant mastermind of what was truly an unjust trial, would later join the Ku Klux Klan. run for the United States Senate, and would eventually obtain a seat on the Supreme Court of the United States. So who in their right mind takes on all the forces of justice?
Well, a guy named Joe Tate did.
Stevenson's daughter became Catholic against her father's will to marry Pedro Guzman. The wedding was performed by Father James Cole, but when Stevenson found out about it,
as the circuit solicitor for Birmingham, Alabama, Joe Tate could have passed on this case. He could have just let it die in the grand jury. He could have not pressed for the charge to come out of the grand jury as hard as he did, but he didn't do any of that. He decided that justice had to be done for Father Coyle.
The defendant, Edwin Stevenson, was Klan.
3 of the 4 defense attorneys were Klan. You had an all-white, all-male jury. You had a number of Klansmen sitting on that jury.
Joe Tate deciding to prosecute this case to the fullness of his power was like David going up against Goliath.
It would have been easier for him to not take the case, but instead, he wanted to do the right thing for the law, for Ruth Stevenson, and for Father Coyle. He wanted justice. It was the most...
Father Coyle is the guy that called educators down from the north to help start the first black school here in Birmingham. He had in his heart this fight for freedom and for liberty, that every human being was of equal worth and value.
Goodness is not something that you run away from. Being good was why Father Coyle was actually attacked.
He rose up as a martyr, fighting for what is right for all people.
It's important that we remember where we came from in Birmingham and in Alabama.
We need to learn from our past, but not live in the past. Learning from the past helps us to face a greater and better tomorrow and accept today.
my hopes for this film are that people in the state of Alabama, city of Birmingham, and across the nation can look at a historical event and see the transformation of a people over a period of time.
In a sense, somebody took his life, but he knew he probably wound up being killed. Even when he came back to Birmingham after having a long, extended stay in Ireland, he said, I'm coming back to give my life at Birmingham, if you'll have me.
And here we are 100 years later, still talking about this trial.
If you go into the jury room and throw out the evidence and render a not guilty verdict, gentlemen of the jury, you will have all the narrow-minded, redneck people come out and pat you on the back. But for the remainder of your lives, you will have your conscience to prick and sting you.
Justice means that everybody should have their rightful due. That's what Father Coyle was about. That is the universal truth. Justice.
And so the makers of that film, Edie Hand and Mark Sims. Thank you.
Yeah. Folks, I'm Mark Sims, and I'm a history buff. And I love the state of Alabama, and I love the city of Birmingham. In the audience today is my high school history teacher, Jim Kilgore. He was one that influenced me and pushed me to dig into history and to pursue my interest there. And so one night I'm watching Alabama Public Television, and I come across a documentary about this story. And at the end of the documentary, find out about Sharon Davies' book, Rising Road. Of course, I don't make films then, but I do now. So I had the idea this would make a great movie. That was about 7 or 8 years ago. And a year ago, I ran into and met Edie Hand. And after meeting her and talking with her, I asked her if she would help me get the film rights to this book, of which we obviously have. And from that, we hope to make a feature film. And so within the next 2 years, we hope to have that accomplished. We're going to have a multi-million-dollar budget, and we hope that the city of Birmingham will help us to produce this film. Now, while I've got God here in the house, and I've got witnesses here, and the FBI is here, there will be a cross burning and a KKK rally on my property in Blount County within the next 2 years as we shoot this film. So I don't want to end up in federal prison. So if I need a permit, I need to talk to you gentlemen today about that. So,
I think you know the right people now.
So having said all that, let Edie Hand speak to you about what we're trying to do, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for having us today, and what a great event to have here at the 16th Street Baptist Church and the Civil Rights Institute. And thank you to the FBI and all of your efforts to try to keep us safe in a place that we love to worship. I so love what Sharon Davies has said to us in her book many times. If we can't learn from our past, how can we grow and make the future better? So what Mark Sims, as a businessman, and myself as a producer and writer, wanted to utilize my resources around the country and in Hollywood to help to bring this book to life and to showcase films and stories to be brought to life here in Birmingham, Alabama, that they do in Hollywood. Why can't we do it in Birmingham? Right? And it does take a village. It takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of time. But more importantly, it takes the integrity of what your book is about. It's like what Joe Tate, our prosecutor at that time in 1921, wanted to do. He was a man of integrity. He wanted to help Ruth. He wanted to help her make her life better. And he also wanted to do the right thing for Father Cole. We're so grateful to St. Paul Cathedral and to Jim Pinto for all the people that have helped us to understand your story to be brought to life, Sharon. And I've seen through this, and even the actors that we utilized were from Birmingham, Alabama, except for the young man that was portraying the role of Joe Tate. That is my son, Link Hand. He lives in Hollywood. And in his portraying that, as we see what comes to life, is that you have to find funds to do things like this as we put it together. Now, Mark Sims might be a very successful businessman, but he has to have other successful businessmen and women to help to make it happen. So therefore, we are on that pursuit to make this happen, to have this pursuit of justice come to life. There will be an educational arm of this that through our Alabama Public Television that Roy Clem wants to help us with, through my good friend Sharon Tinsley that heads up the Alabama Broadcasting Association, to across the country of other groups that want to see stories like this come to life. So I hope that you will join us in doing that. And you know, because of that too, just to give you a side note of also Sharon Davies' daughter is a writer in the film industry in Los Angeles. Not only have I spent the last 40 years of my life writing and producing, but in the last decade of resources of developing educational films, but also to create a film like what Mark and I want to do for the big screen. there could be someone like a Mark Wahlberg, perhaps. He's a good Catholic guy that would like to be a part of this. And also, it is who we know in making and bringing it to life that people will want to come out and see it. Recently, my son Link, that portrays Joe Tate in this particular promo that we've done, you can look for him on CBS this spring. He is portraying a role as a Black Hawk pilot on the remake of MASH, which is pretty exciting on your station on CBS this spring. So our Birmingham influence has touched the world. It really has. So I hope that we can make a difference and help you more here with your Civil Rights Institute and helping to bring justice, because I do understand it, not just as a writer or someone that has been a part of the film and advertising world all of my adult life, but I tell you, I experienced personally to have a passion for this. 2 of my first cousins in Chicago, Illinois were killed near their churches by gangs. And when you personally see things like this happen to you and you experience it, but more importantly that you have the help of the law enforcement and the FBI to find these people and bring them to justice, to make a difference, for we can go to our churches and worship in peace and feel safe. I thank you for that you're able to do that. Again, I want to thank you for allowing us to be a small part of this. I hope that Mark Sims and I can make you proud over the next 2 years, that in 2021, that will be 100 years that we will bring Sharon Davies' book, Rising Road, to life in your theater and for educational arm throughout our educational television system, to bring it into secondary schools, to educate people on the past that they can learn from, and hopefully we can have more love for our humankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Edie. We don't want a Groundhog Day on hate. So I think it's powerful that things are moving so that this story really doesn't have to be repeated, that we can learn. I want to just recognize Lanice Washington, who was the Bessemer Cutoff District Attorney as well. We appreciate all members of law enforcement and the courage it takes for all of you to pursue justice when often you could be faced with a public that does not want what you want. We're moving right along, and so the next part of the conference today will be a panel discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists. When I say your name, you can come on up and take your seat, and we will then have a moderator to do that part. So first on our panel, this is Hate Crimes in Houses of Worship. Reverend Arthur Price, who is the pastor here at 16th Street Baptist Church. Reverend Thomas Wilder, pastor of Bethel Baptist Church. Ashfaq Tawfiq, who is the president of the Hoover Crescent Islamic Center. Jasvinder Singh, who is a doctor of UAB medicine and a member of the Sikh community. Please welcome. John Martinoni, Director of the Office of New Evangelization of the Catholic Diocese of Birmingham. And this panel will be moderated by Dr. A. Kristen Adeolian, who is at the School of Public Health in the Department of Social Work at Samford University. Adios. If you need the PowerPoint, just look that thing.
Well, we're all welcome today. This is like Reverend Arthur Price has basically introduced. This is a very epochal day, and by my calculation, I realized that today is exactly 56 years and 14 days to that event that happened here at 16th Street Baptist Church, which for all of us know basically was a milestone event that changed, the face, of civil rights in the United States of America, and more importantly, the role of congregations and place of worship, in addressing hate crimes. Now, I would like the gentlemen on the panel to please introduce themselves, their respective place of worship, and then from there I'll carry on. Reverend Price, sir.
Reverend Arthur Price, pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church.
I'm Jaswinder Singh. I'm a Sikh American.
Pull it closer.
I'm Jaswinder Singh. I'm a Sikh American, and our place of worship is here in Alabama, Westwood.
John Martinoni, Director of the Office of Evangelization for the Catholic Diocese of Birmingham, and my parish is St. Paul's Cathedral.
And I am Christon Adedoyin from Stanford University. I teach in the Department of Social Work in the School of Public Health. And so the way I'm going to take this is basically first and foremost to acknowledge very profusely the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the U.S. Department of Justice, for a job well done in organizing this with the Birmingham, Civil Rights Institute. One of the things I want to ask our panelists is this. This program basically is part of the FBI Civil Rights initiative to work with houses of worship. Reverend Price, I want to start with you. What has your church done in partnership with the FBI, particularly with regards to the Civil Rights program?
Well, I participated in the Civil Rights Citizens Academy program with the FBI. We've hosted events here at the church that talks about hate in the community to promote education and awareness about specific crimes that target hate. Former U.S. Attorney Doug Jones have presented here many times. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance has presented programs here many times. We've hosted the former U.S. Attorney Generals Loretta Lynch and Eric Holder here as well. So we have a long-standing history with law enforcement here at 16th Street Baptist Church because we owe a great debt of gratitude to the U.S. Attorney's Office and to the FBI for picking up the case in the recent years after the church bombing. It took 14 years to bring the first perpetrator to justice. And since that time, we've been working with law enforcement to make the community more aware about hate crimes and what's going on in the community.
Okay, thank you, sir. To Dr. Jaswinder Singh, in my research, one of the things I found out was that as of September 28, which was Friday, there have been 44 hate crimes against the Sikh community. Would you please tell us what the Sikh community has been doing, working in partnership with the FBI and other law enforcement to actually stem the tide of hatred against the Sikh community?
So I don't have any specifics with regards to Birmingham in particular, but I know that there's a lot of leadership across the country that have been working with FBI and other organizations in bringing up the awareness with regards to hate crimes against the Sikhs. As one can imagine, 9/11 was a change point for a lot of Sikh Americans who, especially Sikh men with their turbans, were identified as Muslims and as maybe representative of what some Americans saw as the enemy. This then, as you are aware, has led to a lot of hate crimes, both hate speech as well as crimes against Sikh Americans, men and women who look a little different than some other Americans. But that's sort of the beauty of America, is that we all look different. We are flowers a different color in a garden of beauty. However, some people out of fear can take a friend to be an enemy. So I don't have any specific examples, but we've had interactions with invitation to law enforcement agencies to our local temple. We try to work with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute with regards to providing community meals, which is one of the main representation of our faith, opening its door to people of the entire community. We've tried to do that, but I don't have any other specific examples other than there's a national movement in terms of people raising the awareness. One of the main foundation of Sikhism is to seek justice for all, and seeking justice for all, including Sikh Americans, is something that we all feel passionately about.
Thank you so much. To my next panelists, that's Mr. John Matigoni. I would want us to build on the momentum Dr. Davis had actually, laid out. And I'd realized that the Catholic Church has been probably one of the primary targets of hate crimes. And could you please walk us through how you've been able to work with law enforcement, particularly FBI, and what can other places of worship and religious organizations learn from the Catholic Church?
Well, we've had really recently in the Birmingham area, Birmingham Diocese, which runs from basically Clanton to the Tennessee border and then Mississippi to Georgia, so north central Alabama. Not really any hate crimes to speak of, but across the country you can read fairly often Catholic churches vandalized, our Eucharistic host stolen, to be used and desecrated. You can see on YouTube, if you Google desecration Eucharistic host, people on YouTube and getting tens of thousands of views. But what we're doing in general is we're trying to figure out the best way to protect our houses of worship from potential, as being potential targets for people who hate us or for whatever reason. And so we're working with the FBI, local law enforcement. We have a gentleman who's in charge of the properties for the diocese, and he's constantly talking to law enforcement about what is the best way to secure our buildings. For example, at St. Paul's, we now have, at every Mass, we have a police presence on the front sidewalk, and he'll walk around the church. So we have law enforcement very visible, because you're torn between, well, should we have armed guards inside the church? Well, you don't want to do that. This is God's house, place of worship. So there's a balance that we're struggling to find, and working with FBI and local law enforcement to try to find that balance, because larger churches like St. Paul's, well, we can hire a guard. Smaller parishes with maybe 100 families, 150, maybe they can't. So what do? So right now, we don't have any finalized plans of action that I'm aware of, although we're working towards something, and again, working very closely with, as I understand it, the local law enforcement, both local, state, and federal law enforcement.
Thank you very much, sir. Back to Reverend Price. For congregants and pastors and religious leaders who are here, can you please allay the fears of working with law enforcement? Given your experience and given the historical importance of this church, how would you please work congregations, place of worship that are basically hesitant or undecided to work with law enforcement? Could you please try to, basically deconstruct the fear, the suspicion, or the apprehension?
Well, I would say to other churches and houses of worship that being someone who formerly worked in law enforcement, that number one job is to work with victims of crime. they're in the victim protection business. So if you have been a victim of a crime, the best advocate to have on your side is someone from the law enforcement side of it. Whether it's the FBI, whether it's your local police, whether it's the DA's office, their job is to advocate for the voiceless and for the victim. So if you've been a victim of a hate crime, they could be a very good ally. Now, there's a lot of mistrust in our community about the type of service that we get from law enforcement, from being the African American congregation, that there's like two different types of different justice systems going on. But if you build relationship with your local sheriff, with your local DA, with your local U.S. attorney, with your local local law enforcement entities, you can really see them as being an asset to helping you get things done.
Thank you, sir. To Dr. Singh, I want to ask, one of the things in my preparation for this was that I came across what is called the Gurdwara Security Toolkit that the Sikh community has been able to build up. Could you just walk us through or share with our audience, how you've been able to come up with this Gurdwara Security Toolkit, and walk us through how you, in partnership, that is the Sikh community in partnership with the federal authorities, were able to come up, with preventive measures?
So I am not aware of a lot of details of the toolkit, but I'm assuming that we actually have incorporated some of them at our local temple here in Birmingham. Since the Wisconsin shooting of and death of 7 Sikh Americans a few years ago, I think there was probably the incentive and the desire to come up with this preventive measures of working with local and federal law offices to come up with preventive strategies. Again, not being aware of that toolkit particularly, I'm not sure what are the components. I know that for our local Gurdwara, which is for us the place of worship, or another name for temple, meaning the door to the Guru, we have installed cameras. We've had frequent interaction with local law enforcement agencies. We have in the beginning, when the incident happened a few years ago in Wisconsin, we went to the extent of locking the temple every time after somebody entered due to fear. That was not the toolkit. That was a reaction to having been hurt and not knowing what to do, being a small group of people who came to the temple to worship. I don't think that's part of the toolkit. I think that was a manifestation of a community that was in fear and trying to do everything to protect their children coming to the temple, to protect themselves. I would like to learn about this toolkit, I'll be honest with you. I'd love to understand how we can use this toolkit locally for our temple. We've been fortunate, I think, with the exception of some email or a text message with regards to hate speech, we've not had hate crime committed against in the local congregation. But again, as others have done, we would like to learn about this toolkit and see if we can incorporate other aspects of these preventive measures and work even more collaboratively with our federal and local law enforcement agencies.
Okay, just building on what you just said, when I met Special Agent Cornelius Harris last Friday in preparation for this, one of the materials he gave to me, which I believe every congregation should have, is the hate crime threat guide of the FBI. You mentioning things like, email threats, physical threat, verbal threat, phone threat, and written or visual threat are considered, signals or flashpoints, to hate crime. So I just wanted to let audience know that the FBI is basically on top of things that regard all forms of threat, whether verbal, electronic, or otherwise. Now that takes me back to that takes me back to Mr. John Matigoni. Now, you mentioned the fact that in your congregation now you have law enforcement being around. How have you been able to actually, address the issue of separation of church and state? Because now when law enforcement is coming to the church, one of the arguments people have is that there's an intrusion, or probably the law enforcement or the government is coming into your business. So how have you been able to balance that with parishioners? How have you been able to allay the concern of parishioners, against intrusion of government to the place of worship?
Well, we don't see any difficulty with church and state issues at all. Number one, the the officers are off-duty officers, so they are not fulfilling official requirements, governmental related requirements. Number two, we look at it more as a complementary relationship rather than a adversarial relationship, church and state. So the parishioners, I know I see them talking all the time to the officer, different officers, and basically they get to know us, we get to know them on more of a personal level rather than looking at it, he's representing the state. We don't look at it like that at all. So we have not had any issues along those lines whatsoever.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Now, Reverend Arthur Price, I want to throw this question to you. Now, for each of our panelists, this also applies to you. What would you consider to be the role of law enforcement in the prevention, preparation, and partnership with hours of worship? How would you explain those three dimensions of prevention, preparation, and partnership? And of course, I wanted to also bring in the community into it. Because one of the arguments that always been made is that no matter how much place of worship try to work with law enforcement, if the community is not basically involved, which is basically now makes a cord that cannot be easily broken. How do you think the congregation or the place of worship, especially your congregation, basically becomes the bridge between law enforcement and the community? Reverend, sir.
That's a difficult question to answer. Prevention, preparation, and what was the other P?
And partnership.
Partnership. Well, partnership would probably be the key. If law enforcement could have a crystal ball to prevent crime, I think they would. I think everybody would want that formula, what they have. So, for prevention, for a law enforcement standpoint, I think visibility is key. I think visibility deters some suspicious activity. If law enforcement is present, that may deter someone from trying to commit a crime on your facilities. Now, it's hard to measure a deterrent, because if it doesn't happen, it's a deterrent. If it does happen, you say it's not a deterrent, but we don't know how many threats we've had against us that because we had law enforcement present, that was a deterrent. So just by being visible, that's preparation. That's prevention. Preparation is dealing with partnership, that you don't view law enforcement as the enemy, but you view them as a partner, that we are a high visible church. We get tens of thousands of visitors that visit us each and every year. Any given Sunday, we have anywhere from 20 to 200 visitors here. So we want to make sure that their stay in Birmingham is a pleasant stay. So we want to make sure that we can pick up the phone, or we can call law enforcement to partner with us in educating and enlightening the community on things that are happening that they feel as though the community should be up to speed upon.
Thank you very much, sir. And the same to you, sir.
So I'll speak to preparation first. I think that the same principles as just outlined would apply in terms of working closely with the law enforcement agencies. In terms of prevention, I think that for us to have a heightened awareness and communication with local and federal law enforcement agencies, even to the early signs of hate speech and hate actions, which we sometimes ignore as something trivial. I think for us to have the heightened sensitivity and for us to actually communicate this to the law enforcement agencies could actually empower them to perhaps prevent some of these hate crimes. I agree that visibility does help, but it also brings up the issue of we have our law enforcement agencies that don't have the staffing to be at every place of worship and be at every place. So there are some challenges with regards to resources. I think in terms of prevention, one thing that I think about in particular is, at least for Sikhism in America, which not many people know about, our preventive strategies are also not just law enforcement, but actually community engagement. We, as a Sikh American community, have to engage and give to our communities and serve them, serve the most needy parts of our community. So we have to go out there and spread the awareness of what the faith is, how it is like every other faith in the world, although it may have some symbolism and what the symbolism is. But more importantly, what we are doing for Bessemer, what we are doing for Birmingham, what we're doing for Alabama. How can we generate that awareness, that kindness that we show to community, and the community then shows back to us? Can that prevent all hate crimes? No. But can that help us follow our faith more faithfully, more truly? I think so.
Thank you. And to you, Mr. John.
Well, as both of these gentlemen have said, visibility of law enforcement can't be everywhere. They don't have the resources, but there are higher profile churches, such as this church. St. Paul's Cathedral would be in that category. A lone Sikh temple would be in that category. So, there are places where you can have guards, law enforcement, off-duty police officers, but you also, I think, need, and this is what, again, I mentioned earlier, we're looking into is training. The pastors need to be trained. What are you looking for? Has someone come by lately and that seemed not quite right? Maybe contact law enforcement, get in touch with them. Maybe training for ushers at the doors. Are there certain traits you can look for? If someone's acting a certain way, and I don't even know, I'm just speculating. But working with FBI, local law enforcement, to get the kind of training you need to maybe help prevent something from happening that involves the pastors and the parishioners, the congregation, as well as simply relying on law enforcement.
Okay, we're still on time, and I want to shift a little bit to what the national discourse has been. Different reasons have been adduced or hypothesized to being the reason for the rising spate of hate crimes, against hours of worship. For instance, in the Hill, that is one of the political blog, Rabbi Jason Kelman, after the loss of Lori Gilbert Kerr, who was murdered while protecting a rabbi, said that white nationalism is a very, very powerful reason for the rise of hate crimes against place of worship. I want each of you to respond to that. How do you think the rise of white nationalism has contributed, to the rising spate of hate crimes against place of worship? Reverend.
I think speech has power. I think we have to watch our rhetoric. That some of the rhetoric that we're hearing in our country today has empowered certain people to act upon so-called speech. That everyone doesn't see the rhetoric as just being rhetoric. Some see it as a call and command to do something. So we have to be very careful in the language that we use, that words do have power, that you never know what those words will embolden somebody else to do. So we who are in position of power have to make sure that that we know that our words matter, and that we have to temper our rhetoric and temper it down, because they do have some very ill effects on house of worship and on other people. So I think toning down the rhetoric is very key.
Dr. Singh?
So well said. We are a nation of immigrants. The beauty of our nation is because we've all come together. 5 years ago or 500 years ago, we all came from a different part of the world. So for us to forget our history and think this country belongs to me, you, or them is a total misunderstanding of who we are. We cannot start history from 200 years ago, but if we all understand, then we can defeat these forces of division. The forces of love and unity are always going to be far more powerful. They're not heard that often. I think we need to all speak up. As there are voices of division that we hear a lot more nowadays, we need to have our community leaders who lead us, who we all look up to, give their words of love and empathy and the true history of our nation. The true history of our nation is that the people to whom the nation belongs still need justice, and so do all of us. So we can't, the whole point of white nationalism does not make any sense unless you just start history at about 400 years ago or 300 years ago. There's absolutely no historical sense, and even if there were, love is far more powerful than hate, and unity is far more powerful than division. And I think that I'm not answering the question the way you asked me, but what I'm trying to say is we have a lot of messengers of love here in this community, in Birmingham, in Alabama, and throughout the nation. And why don't all of us speak up? And our message of love can be heard just as powerfully as some of the most powerful voices that are misdirected and are trying to just take a very ugly view and a very negative view of a history in a certain way. If you look at history the way it is, there is no rationale or logic for white nationalism. Not in this country.
Dr. John, your response.
Well, I can't really add anything to those first two. What I can say is, unfortunately, in our day and age, because of technology, fringe elements can get a recognition or notice through the internet that goes far beyond their actual influence and their actual numbers. And sometimes, and there are some in media, and I'm not talking about any local media here, but more so really on the national side of things, that we have these 24-hour news channels on both sides of the political spectrum that, well, they need the news. So they look for things to blow up and really focus on when those things don't need to be focused on. Because, you'll have a rally with 200,000 people and a counter rally of 25 gets just as much attention. And that should not be. And those people are looked at, well, these represent, well, no, they don't. You got a bunch of fools out there doing things that TV camera just should ignore, period, in my opinion. I understand freedom of the press and all, but there's certain times where you have to exercise discretion and you have to say, well, that's not the story. The story was these 200,000 people who are out here peacefully marching for justice, for truth, for whatever it may be, and you got these 25 crazies that you're pointing the camera at, and they get just as much and sometimes more time because it's thought controversy is what gets the ratings. And so that's maybe where we need to have some introspection and look at what we're doing in that regard.
I mean, building on that, it's like you're basically looking into my notes, and I've not seen you stretch into my notes.
I was leaning.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to address was this: that what's our place of worship doing to counter misinformation and the misuse of social media? Because, like you rightly articulated, if there is misinformation and spread of hate in the social media using technology, I start with you, Dr. John. how do you think congregations can use technology to counter or counteract the spread of AIDS?
Well, I would just say, whenever you see it, you have to be discreet. You have to use your judgment, because sometimes if you call attention to something, again, it gets a lot more attention than it deserves. And so you have to be judicious, but then there are certain things that just cry out to God to be answered. And so you need people who are online to articulate a response that is a response of love and intelligence and justice, and say, no, these certain things are wrong and we will not be tolerated. So I would say more, if you have within your sphere of influence, friends, families, etc., and someone on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter sends out something, you need to be bold enough to be willing to hurt their feelings and say, maybe you should not have sent that. Maybe you should think about all the things that you might think, oh, this is harmless and it means this, but other people are looking at it and taking it another way, and so you need to be sensitive to that, and you need to think about that before you send that tweet or post that thing. I mean, I'm in a neighborhood group, and one of my neighbors posted something that I thought, I can't believe you put that up there. You know, and it was ignorance, not hate or malice, but ignorance can be very easily mistaken for hate and malice, and or ignorant statements can be. And I was just waiting for other people in the neighborhood just to start hammering that, which would cause this downward spiral of hate on the internet. And so I privately messaged this person who I didn't even know. I said, you may want to rethink your post and maybe withdraw it, because I don't think you realize the full impact of what you're saying. And thankfully, a couple hours later, it was gone. But that's what each one of us can do, again, in our spheres of influence. And then, we have, like, our pastor he's online, other pastors who are online, who are constantly putting things out there about, social justice matters, religious matters, matters of peace, love, and treatment of your neighbor, and so forth.
Dr. Singh?
So to add to that, I'd like to divide that into things we do and things we should do. I think things we do are minimal, to be honest with you, because we're so busy in our congregation and things we want to do for in the place of worship, sort of focusing on God and the message, that we don't usually plan and respond on social media as much. However, I think things we should do, social media is extremely powerful to the extent that it can bring revolutions in some places. It has the power. Hate speech is always going to be powerful, even for people who don't agree with it, because people are going to look at it, because people inherently, for anything that's too far to the right or left or too far away from the center, is going to get a lot of attention. I don't think that religious organizations or places of worship have come together as a group to think of a strategy. Again, going to all the points that you just made, there are individual reactions that people, pastors and priests and other leaders can have. But these people who spread this hate on the web, they're very smart and organized, and they know what words to use to incite, to mislead people. On the other hand, the forces that are there to neutralize them, like the forces in the communities or in the religious place of worship, are not focusing on that. So I think that pretty much that really needs to be a collaboration between perhaps the leaders in the community, the leaders in the religious organizations, and people, some young people who know how to message on the web, to have an integrated response for cities and communities and even states for us to have a stronger message back or way to respond, because you definitely want to respond in the way that you neutralize and not further ignite the controversy. Because all people who post hate speech on the web, they not only want to mislead other people, but they want controversy and they want attention. So how can you neutralize that and have a more powerful message, and at the same time not start controversy? Is going to take resources and a lot of different minds to come together. I don't think we've done that. I think we really should think about how to do that, and that'll require a lot of great minds to come together and various organizations to come together, I think.
I mean, Reverend Arthur Price, given the very unique role 16th Street Baptist Church, has in the nation and globally, how would you address this same issue of using technology, deploying, social media to counter hate speech and, hate crimes generally?
Well, my answer is probably really simplistic, is living out what it is that you've been commissioned to do. So we've been commissioned to live, love, and learn like Jesus Christ. So if that's our profession of faith, then that's not something we just do inside these four walls. That's something that we do on social media. That's something we do when we're outdoors. That's something we do in school, at work, that we know that the eyes of the Lord is everywhere. And so we ought to live our lives in such a way that we are living a life that is pleasing unto the Lord. I take the standpoint of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was building the walls, but he wanted to make sure that the walls were being rebuilt, and Sanballat and a host of other people were trying to get him to come down, but he said, I'm doing a good work, I'm staying on the wall, I'm working my piece of the wall. And I think if every church, if every person works their piece of the wall and take their piece of the wall, then we can get a whole lot accomplished.
One of the things I've learned today is when you basically moderating spiritual people, you've got to be very careful, because they seem to have a peer into what I've written. Because the last question I was going to ask is this: what partnership can be mobilized across religious denomination or religious divides? And as you probably must have heard, they've actually addressed it. But as a closing remarks in the next 5 minutes, which we have, my question is this: how can different religious bodies and organizations work together? Because this matter now is basically affecting Jews, Catholics, Sikhs, Baptists, Methodists. When hate crime comes, it does not discriminate or does not in any way isolate any religious group. So starting with Reverend Price, how do you think different religious groups and affiliations and denominations can work together, of course in partnership with the FBI, to overcome, and like Dr. Davis said, so that we don't have a repeat of history?
Well, Dr. King said, if we don't learn to live together, we will perish as fools. So I think that we can all learn from each other's tragedies. I think one of the things that happens in the Black church experience is that we have an affinity for the Exodus motif from the Jewish history, as we were not immigrants of this country by volunteering to come over here. We were forced over here, and we were placed in captivity over here, but we're waiting for God to deliver us to our freedom. And during the civil rights movement, that whole Exodus motif played out, and they drew on that Exodus motif to get the freedom that we have today. So I think for those in Pittsburgh, those in Charleston, South Carolina, those here at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, those who have, in the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, those who have had tragic events, that we can draw strength from one another and build on those strengths.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Singh?
I think that we need to work and partner in community programs with the other religious congregations across the city and the state. So I need to learn about all the wonderful programs that the other parishes, churches have for the homeless. For they have the programs they have in terms of feeding the poor, housing the poor. I think that if I can learn about those sort of programs, if our community can learn about those sort of programs, and we can bring our resources and our hard work together, perhaps if the community sees the synagogue's leader and the church's leader and the Sikh temple leader, they are co-sponsoring a homeless shelter program for the Birmingham poor. There'd be no distinction between the faiths. There'd be no distinction between the communities. There's one community here. It's the Birmingham community, it's the Alabamians. If we could learn about those sort of programs and that the other organizations have success with, that we could partner with them, we'd like to do that. I think that's one thing that I aspire, or our community would aspire towards, if we can join hands. Because people in different organizations, religious or community, have their successes. They're looking for more people or more resources to come to them. And if we can all join hands together as organizations and benefit the city of Birmingham, the poor and the needy people in Birmingham as a start, I would see that as a great way for us to work together and to get to know each other and to celebrate successes that others have had.
Reverend John Matsugoni, the last word.
Well, just to add, I agree 100% with what Reverend Price and Dr. Singh have said, but maybe to add something else, is share a personal experience involving, I believe, dialogue between the churches is necessary. Christians need to know other Christians. Even if you disagree with what they believe in certain ways, in certain areas, well, that's fine. I always tell people, I say, look, I have no problem with you disagreeing with what I believe as long as you're disagreeing with what I actually believe. You know, and I'll just, again, this one experience that happened within the last year, a very large church over the mountain, I won't mention the name, had 6 Wednesday nights in a row where they focused on the teachings of the Catholic Church. They weren't Catholic. The Catholics who were married to members of that congregation, of that church, started calling me, saying they're saying things about us that are not true. So I made it to the last session of that 6-week series, and I listened, and the assistant pastor at that church was talking about my faith, and he was getting it wrong about 80% of the time. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. I didn't say anything, I didn't raise my hand or cause any commotion, which my wife would tell you is a miracle in and of itself. But I waited till afterwards, and I went up to him. There were still several people gathered around. You know, after a talk, people gathered around the speaker, asked more questions. And I listened as these people were trashing my faith. And I just sat there with a smile on my face. And I finally said, well, I'm Catholic. And I said, look, and I started talking to the minister. I said, listen, I appreciate the spirit in which you were giving your presentation. I said, you are concerned about the souls of Catholics. I, as a Catholic, appreciate that. Now, they think if you believe what the Catholic Church teaches, you're going to hell. I understand. And I have no problem with that because he's concerned about my soul. But what I told him, I said, but you got what I believe wrong most of the time. And I would imagine as a minister of the Christian faith, you would not want to put false information out there about other people's faiths, about their faith traditions, even if you disagree with them. And we had a good 10, 15-minute conversation, which all the people around were just sitting back, just watching. I finally turned around and I said, would something like this interest you if we made this a public dialogue? And they all went, yes. And the associate pastor said, yes, I would love to do that. So I said, okay, well, let's get it done. Well, I would need the approval of my senior pastor. And I recognized what he was doing. So the next day I sent his senior pastor a letter. And I never got a response. You know, and I ended up going to lunch with the associate pastor, and I told him, I said, what I am disappointed in is that you're willing to talk about us behind the closed doors of your church, but not out in public. I said, that bothers me, because that goes from, now you're not ignorant. Now this is an enforced ignorance, and you're allowing your people to believe things that I have told you are not true. Now, I don't expect members of that church will come and try to shoot up my church or anything like that. But that's where things like that begin. Ignorance. Ignorance, ignorance, ignorance. It's a horrible thing. And when it's enforced ignorance or deliberate ignorance, that is where I believe people, that's where malice starts to come in. And we have to dialogue with each other, talk to each other, to, again, not necessarily agree on every article of faith, but to understand that you believe what you believe, this is why, I believe what I believe, this is why, and as we get to know each other better, we're all building up this you know, for the Christians, the body of Christ, but for the larger religious community, the community of religion in Birmingham and greater Birmingham as a whole.
Thank you very much. Please, could you give our panelists a round of applause? Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless you, sir.
And a round of applause for our moderator. Just our talking points. Knowledge is power. Speech has power. We are different flowers in the same garden. Listen to the rhyme of history. Love is more powerful than hate, and we all have a role to play. We're going to close out listening to the A.H. Parker Gospel Choir, and then we will dismiss and go across the street to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute for a tour for anyone who would like to. The tour guides will be the Legacy Youth Leadership Program from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And the reception.
Check, check, 1, 2.
I just wanna praise you forever and ever and ever and ever and ever for all you've done for me. Blessings and glory, and honor, they all belong to you. Thank you, Jesus, for blessing me. I just wanna praise you forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. You've done for me. Blessings and glory, and honor, they all belong to you. Thank you, Jesus, for blessing me. Oh, I just wanna praise you forever and ever and ever for all you've done for me. Blessings and glory, thank you, Jesus, for blessing me. I just wanna praise you forever and ever and ever and ever and ever for all you've done for me. Blessings, blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus, for blessing me. I just want to praise you forever, forever and ever, and ever, and ever, for all you've done for me. Blessings, blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Blessings and glory and honor, they all belong to you. Thank you, Jesus, for blessing me.
Thank you, and on that note, we are dismissed to the reception and the tour. Thank you all.